Today on the Women Mind the Water podcast, I'm speaking with Romina Bayer. Romina is a photography coach and founder of OceanSnaps. Romina hopes to raise awareness about the ocean by teaching divers how to take engaging underwater photos. The Women Mind the Water podcast engages artists in conversation about their work and explores their connection with the ocean. Through their stories, Women Mind the Water hopes to inspire and encourage action to protect the ocean and her creatures. I am pleased to welcome Romina Bayer to the Women Mind the Water Artivist series. Romina learned to dive in Mexico. Later, she managed a dive shop on a remote island in Indonesia. During her years in Indonesia, Romina was inspired by the beauty of the ocean. She was also made aware of the threats facing it. Now living in Germany, Romina has created OceanSnaps, an online platform to teach the fundamentals of underwater photography. Romina hopes her coaching will help aspiring underwater photographers hone their skills and through their photos, expose others to the beauty and fragility of the ocean. Romina, thank you for joining me on the Women Mind the Water podcast. I look forward to learning more about underwater photography and your experiences diving.
Thank you so much for having me, Pam.
It's a pleasure. Romina, when did you develop an interest in the ocean?
So it was actually not until I started scuba diving, because I come from an area in Germany that is very industrial. So it's the Ruhr Valley, and it's not close by the ocean. So I didn't grow up by the ocean. So it came a little bit later in my life when I started to scuba dive.
So what got you interested in diving?
It's funny because it's actually a coincidence that got me into scuba diving, because I was on vacation in Mexico and it was raining all the time. I mean, I was there in the middle of rainy season, so that was a little bit to be expected, but I felt like there was not much to do or to explore on land in like heavy rains. And so I thought, if I'm going to get wet anyway, I might as well go underwater. And so I was very naive back at the time. I just walked into a dive shop and I heard about cenotes. It's like this kind of caves in Mexico, very special to the area, very unique also to the area. And so I was like, okay, cool. So I just want to go dive there. And the people at the dive shop were like, okay, but are you certified? I'm like, no, I'm not certified. I just want to dive the cenotes. And they were like, okay, well, you need to take a course first before we can take you diving. And so this is how I actually got started.
So apparently those first experiences were a little bit rough. What made it difficult and what made you persevere?
Yeah, so I remember clearly I had a lot of trouble on my first dives, even in the pool. So, you do the theory part and then you have some practical parts in the pool first or in shallow water. And then only afterwards you go into the open ocean. And so I remember I was struggling a lot with like a certain exercise that is to fill and then clear your mask. So basically you're letting in water into your mask and then you need to blow it out again so that you can see again. And I was doing this exercise, but I kept water getting up my nose and it was very uncomfortable. I kept coughing and then I felt like I was drowning even though nothing was happening. And so it was a very uncomfortable experience, but somehow I pushed through because I really wanted to get to the open water. And then once we were in the open water, since it was rainy season, also the conditions were not that great. So, it was very, there was a lot of sand. It was very silty underwater. The visibility was not so great. It was very rough seas. So I also got seasick. I got seasick underwater on the boat. Yeah, I kept having the same trouble with the mask clearing. And so I remember it was very, very uncomfortable and I just had to push through it. But the good thing is I knew I really wanted to get my certification, because after I was certified, I was either going to go dive the cenotes or another special thing that they have in Playa del Carmen in Mexico, where I did my certification, is the bull sharks. And it was the bull shark season. And so I was really excited about either of those dives. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to push through and I can do this. I'm sure I can manage. And so this is actually why I pushed through the whole thing. And I'm so glad that I did, because afterwards, my first fun dive, I decided to go with the bull sharks, not the cenotes. And it was an incredible experience, just being surrounded by a couple of wild animals like this underwater. It's just incredible. And it totally made up for all the trouble during the course.
That's really remarkable. First, because you can't see underwater, and then because you're seasick. And then finally, the thing that's pushing you through is to go diving with sharks.
Yeah, it was totally worth it. I'm so glad that I pushed through. And now I'm encouraging anybody who is having trouble in the beginning to just, keep going, because it's really, really worth it.
Right. You went to Indonesia and ran a dive center?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. No, so after my travels, at some point I had like the little German man inside my head who was saying, oh, you should go back to Germany and get a real job, And so that's what I did for a while. But then I went to the Ocean Film Festival, and over there I was at the screening of a documentary that's called Racing Extinction. And that documentary really, really touched me. So there was this one scene where basically they're talking about shark finning. And so they show how a shark gets cut off its fins and it's thrown back into the ocean. But because they need to move in order to breathe and survive, without its fins, it can't really move anymore. And so it's left in the ocean to suffocate, And that was such a horrible scene for me. And that just made something with me. I don't know. It really moved me. That in that moment, I decided that I want to go back to the ocean and I want to do something also and help protect not only sharks, but the oceans. And so this is the moment where I decided to go back to Indonesia. So my partner, luckily, was also a diving instructor. And so we decided to move back to Indonesia for a while. And then we got the opportunity to manage a dive resort on a tiny, tiny little island. That was absolutely beautiful.
So what's it like to dive in Indonesia? What sort of things do you see underwater there?
It's fantastic. Honestly, I think everybody should do it. It's just really like paradise. So the island we were working on, it's inside the Coral Triangle. And so you have a huge biodiversity. And so the island is called Siladen. It's in the north of Sulawesi in Indonesia. And it's also inside a marine park. It's called the Bunaken Marine Park that consists of 5 islands. And so you have 5, not uninhabited, but there's not many people living on the islands. And so all the islands are surrounded by very shallow top reefs. So it's also not only great for scuba divers, but also for snorkelers. You have beautiful corals, you have huge biodiversity, you have lots of animals and marine life. And then after the top reefs, it really drops down to hundreds of meters of walls. So you can imagine those really steep walls that are just full of corals, of giant barrel sponges, of soft corals, of Gorgonian sea fans. It's really teeming with life. It's full of life. And you have big fish. You can have lots of turtles, green turtles, for example. Hawksbill turtles as well. We had nesting grounds also on the island. So if you're lucky, you can even see some turtle eggs hatching. Really fantastic. Underwater, you can see trevallies, you can see snappers, sometimes sharks as well. Pilot whales, sometimes if you're very lucky, but those mostly from the boat. But lots of small things also, lots of macro life. So all different kinds of shrimps, of nudibranchs. So nudibranchs, I don't know if the listeners will know, are sea slugs. And I never thought that I would say that I'm a fan of slugs, but sea slugs are really cool. They're a little bit like Pokemon, I like to say, because they come in all different colors and shapes. And so it's really like, collecting all, I mean, in your mind, not actually collecting them or on your pictures,
right?
All the different kind of nudibranchs species. So yeah, you have, just so many fantastic
Well,
things.
I can see by the smile on your face and the way your eyes light up how wonderful it is. So I'm going to ask you, maybe not a fair question, but what sort of challenges do divers encounter when diving in Indonesia?
Yeah, so, it's not much different than in other places in terms of challenges. What you can get a little bit more maybe than in other places is currents underwater. So there it's just important to be aware of them and to know how to position yourself and how to behave in currents and always, stay prudent basically. But other than that, it's really, I mean, as a diver, you should always stick to your safety limits. It's always very important to pay attention to what you're doing because it's not our natural habitat, right? So we're still dependent on air that we take down. So we need to pay attention that we have enough air supply, that we're not staying longer than we're supposed to with the no decompression limit, things like this. But this is no different than in other diving places. So
okay, so you have to be aware, but now you add to it taking pictures, which means sometimes you get sucked into what you're taking pictures of. So at what point did you get interested in underwater photography?
So for me, it was actually very quickly. So basically, it was soon after I did my advanced open water qualification. I actually started with videos, not with pictures. So I had a little GoPro and I started to film everything on my dive. Like sometimes I would just leave the camera running for 20 minutes. But then quickly, you know, after a couple of dives, you realize how much video material you actually have and that you need to go through it again and edit it and like cut out and maybe, you know, do some color changes and things like this. And this just takes a very, very long time. And back then I knew nothing about editing. Like I had to teach myself the whole thing. And I realized very quickly that the material was just piling up on my hard drive without me actually having or taking the time to go through all of it. But I really wanted to share everything that I saw underwater, you know, with my mom, with my grandma, like people who don't go underwater or who have never been there, like to show them what it's actually like. And so this is when I actually switched to photography because I figured it will be much quicker to edit 1 or 2 pictures than a 20-minute video.
Right. So I have no experience diving, but I have snorkeled. And on a few occasions, I've tried to take photos. Several times I used a disposable camera, and once I used a 35 millimeter camera in a plastic housing. The problem is that everything I had was blue. And, you know, besides the color problem, what other things do people typically encounter in trying to take underwater photographs?
Yeah, that's a very good example, Pam. And, you know, the being blue pictures, it's one of the most common ones. And if you know a little bit about diving or like if you've been in that situation before, you might know that underwater color disappears. And so this is why they actually turn out so blue. And red is the first color to disappear. And the deeper you go, the less colors you have and the less light you have available. And so in underwater photography, I found that it really comes down to that. Like light is the biggest problem most of the time. And one of the biggest challenges for underwater photographers because you have less natural light underwater. And this depends on so many other factors as well. And so basically being in this environment that is water makes it much more difficult to take pictures than taking pictures on land. And so because you have less light underwater, you usually need to use an external light source. So either a torch or like the flash of your camera, or even better, like an external strobe. So strobe is just another word for underwater flash, basically.
Right.
That you can use to bring back those colors in your pictures.
So there's another problem besides the blue and needing artificial light, because I take a lot of pictures of wild animals, but I tend to take, or I always take them on land. And I know that animals don't stand still, but when you take them on land, typically, you know, they move along on the ground and they don't often move upwards, but in the ocean, animals can easily move up and down. So how difficult is it to take photos of animals underwater?
That's a very good question, Pam. And, you know, I actually never thought about it that way, but it's true. Like underwater, they can just move in any possible direction. And not only the animals, but also you, because you're also weightless underwater. Right. You're basically like an astronaut in outer space, you know, you don't have any gravity. So it's not only the animal moving, but also you. And so this is a very big challenge also. And here it really comes down to your buoyancy. So you really want to make sure before you start taking pictures underwater that your diving skills that you're really comfortable with your diving skills, you know, that you don't need to think too much about all the things that you're doing, because it's basically just adding up another difficulty level, let's put it like this. And so I think this is a big difficulty for beginners, especially. So make sure you have good buoyancy. You can do exercises for that on every dive. And then it also really helps to pick some subjects that are maybe not so fast moving. So maybe, you know, not a fast sweet-lipped fish or a fast-moving shark or something, but to start with subjects that are a little bit more stationary or slower. Like, for example, the nudibranchs or sea slugs, you know, they tend to move very slow even underwater. And so they are a very good subject to practice on, because there you can really take your time, and take it easy. And it's really important also that you don't just like lie down on the reef or even on the sand just to take a picture, but that you learn to control your buoyancy with your breath and your BCD in order to keep yourself maybe not completely still, but to move very slowly. And that really helps.
I never really thought about that, but yeah, you are moving too. So, so what are some of the most common mistakes that people make in taking photographs underwater?
Yeah, so I think one of the first one is to start too early. So usually when you learn how to dive, you get very excited about it because it's this completely new world that you're entering. And obviously you want to document all of it. And so it's, you know, easy to just pick up a camera and start taking pictures. But as you said, you should really pay attention also to what you're doing first, because there's already so many things. And so I recommend, you know, first getting comfortable with your diving skills and not start in the first few dives already to bring down a camera. Then another thing that is a common mistake is basically to be too fast or too impatient. If you want to take really good pictures underwater, it really helps to take your time, to take it slow, to get to know the subject maybe a little bit, and, you know, to look for this really good photo opportunity and not just like to rush in, take a shot and then rush on to the next subject, but like take it easy and maybe also try to spend a little bit of time with the subject before moving on.
All right. So it'd be great if you'd share some photographs and comment on what makes them successful or point out the mistakes that might have been avoided.
Yes, for sure. So I have brought this first picture here. So maybe to explain or describe a little bit to the listeners as well. So this is a nudibranch. This is the Tamja nudibranch. And so on this picture, we can see it's, it's an okay picture. It's in focus, so that's already a good point. But other than that, the composition is not very engaging. And what we also tend to do underwater is to just point our camera downwards. So this is like the natural position for your body. If you imagine that you're scuba diving in a horizontal position, your head will automatically be tilted downwards. And so naturally, when you start to take pictures, this is also the first position that we start taking pictures in. So taking from the top, pointing downwards. But from a photography perspective, this is not very engaging composition or angle, let's put it this way, most of the time. And then other than that, also on this picture, we can see that there's a lot of grains of sand that I have not edited out on this one here on purpose. So you can see this is a little bit disturbing as well. It's not too bad on this one. Sometimes it gets way worse. Backscatter is also a very common problem. And the coral where the nudibranch is crawling on is very bright and it looks very cluttered as well. So it's not really adding anything to my image either. In contrast, I've brought this other picture. So the second picture of the Tamja here. So you can see it's the same nudibranch, but this picture is completely different. So here the angle is very different. So it really helps usually to get a little bit lower if you can, if the area permits. And try to get closer to your subject as well. And here you can see that the subject is also much more dominant in the picture. So you really get drawn in and you almost feel like you can make a connection with the sea slug on this picture, where it's slightly pointing towards you. And and the background is not so distracting either. And just to reinforce maybe this perspective as well, I have those other pictures. So here on one of them, you can see the Chromodorus koi, and the other one is the Chromodorus villani. So two fairly common nudibranchs. And you can see when you really get down on the eye level of them, or basically on the level of the animal, you can create a perspective that's really, where the composition is much more drawing the viewer in.
Okay. So can you tell me, is there a particular photograph that's special that you're proud of, and what's special about the photo?
Yeah, so This I find really difficult because this for me is always when my imposter syndrome also sets in.
Right.
So it's not only new photographers who get it, it's also older photographers who get it. But here I chose a picture that is, it's also a nudibranch. So this is a Flabellina nudibranch. And, you know, I think it connects well to the other pictures that we've just discussed, as in that nudibranchs are great subjects also for beginners to take their time. And so on this picture here, I have a Flabellina nudibranch. And what makes the Flabellina special is their serrata, so-called, on the back. So you can see it has like all those, it looks almost like hairs or feathers that it has growing on its back, but it's actually like an organism through which the nudibranch can breathe, but it's also used for their self-defense. So just at the tip, they have tiny little spines, so to say, with which they can defend themselves as well. And so why I think this is a better image than the others, for example, is because it has a certain dynamic in it. So you can see the nudibranch here is in a different position. And this you can witness when you're really patient. So it also comes down to when you find a subject, sometimes it will not be in the best position, especially nudibranchs. They're usually crawling somewhere on the bottom or on the reef. So, you know, the background can be very disturbing. But if you take the time and you follow it for a little bit, or you give it a little bit of time and you observe also the environment, sometimes they will go into a better position. Please never, never move a subject yourself. We don't want to touch anything underwater. But by being with the animal and following it and seeing what it naturally does, you can create better images like this. So you can wait for a special moment like this. And when the nudies do those, it always reminds me of horses that kind of like get onto their back legs and really just show all their beauty. And so here the serrata are basically just swaying in the ocean current. And it's a moment where you can really beautifully see those characteristics of the nudibranchs.
These are wonderful pointers, and you are, I can tell you are a wonderful coach and an enthusiastic dive master. So I'm going to ask you, have you noticed in the pictures that you've had, either from the people you're teaching or that you've seen online, that people are documenting changes in the ocean? And is there anything particular that concerns you?
Yes. So not only in other photographers or pictures, but also I've heard from other divers, you know, who've been diving much, much longer than I have, for example. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that concern me, to be honest, for like regarding the health of our oceans, because our oceans are under a lot of threat. Plastic is obviously one of the most common, most obvious things, or most obvious threats, that there's much more plastics in the oceans. And, you know, while living in Indonesia, we could also see that on a daily basis. It's really horrifying how much plastic gets washed into our oceans. But I think a lot of issues also connected to climate change. So ocean acidification, for example, which causes coral bleaching. Then there's overfishing as well. So there's like the fish stock is really depleting. There's much, much less sharks in the ocean nowadays than there were just a couple of years ago. Like shark numbers have really depleted horrifically. It's I don't know, it's terrifying. And so there's unfortunately a lot of things that are threatening our oceans. And I think this is why it's so important that we really protect it.
So before I end the interview, what kind of things can you suggest that people can do to make a positive difference for the ocean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things that we can do, even if we don't realize it. And as divers or underwater photographers or just people loving the ocean, I think it's really good that we share our love with anybody that we meet, and try to inspire others also, you know, to discover our oceans, because there's so many wonderful things underwater that we might have no idea about yet, that we haven't seen yet. I mean, so few of our oceans have actually been discovered yet. Or explored. And so I think it's important to share that passion with other people, to inspire them to learn more, because if people fall in love with the oceans, they will also help protect them. And yeah, I think this is one of the biggest things.
Well, that's why I'm so glad to have you on, because I think we're both trying to do that, you with your photography and me with the podcast. So I'm really grateful for you for being on the Women Mind the Water podcast. It has been great to hear from someone who has spent considerable time underwater and who's helping to document the world below the surface.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you. I'd like to remind listeners that I've been speaking with Romina Bayer for the Women Mind the Water podcast series. The series can be viewed on womenmindthewater.com. An audio-only version of this podcast is available on the Women Mind the Water podcast, on the Women Mind the Water website, on iTunes, and on other sites such as Spotify and Stitcher. Women Mind the Water is grateful to Jane Rice for her song, Women of Water. All rights for the Women Mind the Water name and logo belong to Pam Ferris Olson. This is Pam Ferris Olson. Thank you for listening.